Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause. Well more than a year since Alison Thulis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.
Good morning. The first item of business today is general questions, and we start with question number 1 from Michelle Ballantyne.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government under what circumstances an NHS board would limit the amount of necessary operations that a patient requires due to budgetary concerns.
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
No clinically necessary operation should be curtailed because of budgetary or financial concerns. Funding for NHS borders will increase to £207.7 million, a 44.8% increase in real terms since 2006-07, and in addition, NHS borders will receive £987,000 to target specialities such as ophthalmology and radiology as part of the first tranche of funding to reduce waiting times.
Michelle Ballantyne.
Thank you for that, Cabinet Secretary. I was contacted by a constituent who had been referred and been through the whole process and put on the waiting list for a double hip operation. He was contacted and asked if he would be willing to go to the Golden Jubilee Hospital to have his treatment, which he agreed to. I have to say it was very good, very successful, he's very happy, except that they could only do one hip at a time, which we know clinically is the approach. But when he went to his 12-week assessment and asked, when will I be admitted for the next hip, he was told there is no plans to do your other hip, you have to go back to the beginning and start again. So the question is not about him actually, but he's concerned when he tried to find out why NHS Lothian, as it was, had not approved having both hips done, which is the treatment he was referred for, why that was done. The only whisper he could get back was the only budget that was allocated was for one hip. And that does raise some concerns, and I wondered if the Cabinet Secretary could give some assurance for people who are facing that, that that is not what they're going to experience.
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you. I'm grateful to Ms Ballantyne. If I could ask her to actually email me with some of that detail, then I can look specifically at that issue. I'm pleased your constituent did have his first operation and that went well. It doesn't make sense to me what you've told me. Doesn't make sense and doesn't sound correct either. But if you would care to send me the detail, then I will happily look at that, and as soon as I have an answer, make sure that you have that answer too.
Christine Graham.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To return to the first question, Michelle Ballantyne, about budgetary considerations, does the Cabinet Secretary not agree with me that it's a bit rich for the Tories to top budgets when their proposal to keep tax for the richest cut would have taken 500 million out of our budget, and that pays for an awful lot of medical staff?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, of course, Ms Graham is absolutely correct. If the health budget had been reduced by that amount, fortunately, the Parliament took a different view. But if that had been the case, that is a significant number of additional nurses, doctors, allied health professionals, and so on, all of whom are absolutely critical to delivering the quality of healthcare that we are committed to as a government, and the reduction in waiting times that I've made very clear I intend to see over the next period.
Question number 2, Colin Beattie.
To ask the Scottish Government what its position is on non-medically qualified practitioners providing Botox and other similar treatments.
Minister Joe Fitzpatrick.
For the record, Presiding Officer, I should say that I have a family member who is a qualified beautician. We are currently considering a range of options for Phase 2 of the regulation of independent clinics, which focuses on cosmetic procedures including Botox and derma fillers, which are provided by non-healthcare professionals within non-regulated sites, principally, although not exclusively, administered by beauty therapists and hairdressers.
Colin Beattie.
Thank the Minister for that answer. Given that sometimes desperate circumstances force people to undergo such risky treatment, can you outline what steps the Scottish Government is taking to improve access to such services on the NHS and to better regulate the industry?
Minister.
Botox and injections and other similar procedures are not provided by the NHS for cosmetic rather than medical reasons. In April 2015, the Scottish Cosmetic Intervention Expert Group published a report on regulation of independent healthcare, and its recommendations were accepted by ministers. Phase 1 of the regulations on the 1st of April 2016 focused on independent clinics run by a doctor, dentist, nurse, midwife and dental technician who administer cosmetic procedures such as derma fillers and lip enhancements drugs like Botox, which is a prescribed drug and are required to be registered with Healthcare Improvement Scotland.
Question number 3, Dean Lockhart.
Thank you. To ask the Scottish Government when the feasibility study on junction improvement on the A84 near Blair Drummond Safari Park will be completed.
Minister Paul Wheelhouse.
Transport Scotland commissions its operating company to undertake a feasibility study and outline design for potential improvements at this location. This has taken longer than anticipated as new information in relation to historical accidents came to light during the final evaluation stage. This information is currently being reviewed to consider how this relates to the completion of the study. The Cabinet Secretary for Transport, Infrastructure and Connectivity, Michael Matheson, has asked Transport Scotland officials to ensure that they conclude this report at the earliest opportunity.
Dean Lockhart.
I thank the Minister for that response and update. Community representatives first met in December 2017 to discuss options to improve safety in the junction. The feasibility study was meant to appear in summer 2018 but has since faced the delays mentioned by the Minister. Does the Minister share my frustration about the delays to this report and the concerns that local communities have in relation to safety at that junction?
Minister.
The first thing I should say is I absolutely recognise the strong community interest in this issue. I know this is an issue Mr Lockhart has raised, and indeed Mr Crawford has also raised in the course of his work, and understand the frustration with any delay when such a key study for local community. And will, as I say, the Cabinet Secretary is keen for this to be the final report to be presented to him as the earliest opportunity, and I'm sure he'll be keen to communicate that to Mr Lockhart.
And Bruce Crawford.
Thank you, President Officer. Well, I'm grateful for the information the Minister has provided to Dean Lockhart. I hope the Minister will understand that I'm disappointed it's taken a parliamentary question for this delay to emerge from Transport Scotland. I was informed in October last year that this study would be available in a number of weeks. I informed the community of that response. I hope the Minister will also understand there will be considerable frustration within the Blair Drummond community about this delay, because they have been gallantly campaigning on this issue of important road safety matter for a number of years.
Minister.
Can I, Presiding Officer, absolutely accept the concern that Mr Crawford has raised, and for what it's worth, I apologise to Mr Crawford for the delay in the production of the report. It's for the reasons I've explained in my answer to Mr Lockhart and in the initial answer that additional accident data has been presented, and I would hope Mr Crawford understand the need to make sure we take that on board and make sure that the final report reflects that if necessary. But absolutely, I'm sorry that wasn't communicated to Mr Crawford and he's had to wait for this news today, but I'm sure that Mr Matheson is very keen to make sure that all members who have an interest in this are communicated as soon as possible the final report is produced.
Question number 4, Mark Griffin.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether it will provide an update on the progress of the Neonatal Expenses Fund.
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
A mid-year evaluation report will be published by the end of this month, with the evaluation of the full year following the end of March being published in autumn 2019. To date, for the first 4 months of the scheme, £60,000 has been spent helping 435 families during that first 4 months.
Mark Griffin.
I thank the Cabinet Secretary for that answer. The Cabinet Secretary will know of my own interest in the operation of the fund because of my experience and the time my daughter spent in a neonatal ward. I wonder if the Cabinet Secretary is able to say how the applications to the fund compare with the number of admissions to neonatal or special care wards, and whether there's any variation across health boards, and that perhaps there are some health boards that need an extra push to make sure parents know of this fund.
Cabinet Secretary.
So I can't give Mr Griffin that information at the moment. That will be part of that first full year evaluation, which will happen at the end of March. And although the publication of that is autumn 2019, I will look specifically at some of that data in advance of publication in order to be able to address those questions. I think there are other areas where we are conscious that improvement is needed. We're looking in particular at the availability and the appropriateness of accommodation for parents in those circumstances, and at the quality and the reach of the information being given to parents who should qualify for that kind of support across our health boards and may not be aware of it. So we will look at some of that information in advance of the full year evaluation, and I'll make sure that Mr Griffin understands what we're looking at, the basis of it, and obviously given his keen interest and indeed his pivotal role in this in the first place, see if there is more that he thinks that we might do.
Question number 5, Bob Doris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government how much pupil equity funding has been given to schools in the Glasgow, Maryhill and Springburn constituency.
Cabinet Secretary John Swinney.
Presiding Officer, schools in the Maryhill and Springburn constituency have been given almost £2.9 million of pupil equity funding in both 2017-18 and 2018-19. In the forthcoming financial year, schools in the constituency will receive over £2.9 million as part of more than £22.3 million allocated to schools across Glasgow. This funding is to be spent at the discretion of head teachers and will continue to the end of this Parliament as part of our commitment to invest £750 million to tackle the poverty-related attainment gap.
Bob Doris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I commend the imaginative use of PEF funds by Churnside Primary School in Milton, in my constituency, where social enterprise, high balls low, work with students to improve physical literacy and build student confidence in a fun way. More importantly, Cabinet Secretary, teachers see improvements in children's readiness to learn. Can I ask how the Scottish Government seeks to disseminate examples of such good practice right across Scotland? And I very much hope the Scottish Government will consider continuing to extend PEF funds not just through the lifetime of this Parliament, but given the success in my constituency and the benefit to my constituents, into the next Parliament also.
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, obviously I would love to be in the position to continue the PEF funding into the next Parliament under the leadership of an SNP government, but we will of course the public will, of course, make their choices on that question in 2021. I do commend Churnside Primary School in Mr Doris's constituency in the Milton area. We've seen a tremendous imagination deployed in the utilisation of pupil equity funding. The example that Mr Doris cites is a very good one about the way in which schools acknowledge there are barriers to learning that some young people will face, and those barriers have to be overcome before they can participate in effective learning. We look for solid and sound and evidenced examples of good practice and then share them widely through, for example, the regional improvement collaborative events that are happening this spring. I was at the first one on Tuesday in Murrayfield for the South East Collaborative, and we will ensure that on the networks such as GLOW and the National Improvement Hub, there is a wider understanding of the effective ways in which young people's performance can be enhanced as a consequence of the utilisation of pupil equity funding.
Question number 6, Elaine Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government, in light of the recent comments by the Chief Medical Officer for Scotland, what action it is taking to tackle gender inequality in the practice of medicine?
Cabinet Secretary Jean Freeman.
The First Minister's National Advisory Council on Women and Girls will this month spotlight on women and girls' health, inviting individuals and communities to provide feedback on women and girls' health-related questions. A summary of that feedback, as I'm sure the member knows, will be published on their website, and responses inform future reports to the First Minister. In addition, with the Chief Medical Officer, I will look at how we can strategically, but at pace, focus on necessary improvements in tackling women's health across the NHS.
Elaine Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. That's a very welcome answer from the Cabinet Secretary, and I would certainly want to highlight this month's activities. But is she aware that women's inequality in medicine also includes thyroid patients whose diagnosis and treatment is deeply concerning? And in recognition of that, her colleague, the Minister, wrote to health boards advising them that the Government expects T3 to be prescribed where an endocrinologist has initiated it. What can the Cabinet Secretary do about NHS Tayside, who have blatantly ignored the Government's letter and only yesterday refused T3 to a patient, have said T3 is non-formulary, which is wrong as it is on the formulary, as I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary knows, and have allowed a panel to overrule a specialist clinician who's recognised that this woman needs this life-saving medicine?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to the member for raising this with me. From what she has said, that sounds like a completely unacceptable response from NHS Tayside, and I will ask the Minister to pursue this with them with some urgency in order to resolve the matter so that they follow the guidelines and the clear views that we've expressed to them, as other health boards are doing.
Question 7 has been withdrawn. Question number 8, Donald Cameron.
To ask the Scottish Government what action it is taking to improve ferry capacity in the Highlands and Islands region.
Minister Paul Wheelhouse.
The Scottish Government remains committed to improving ferry capacity in both the Clyde and Hebrides Ferry Services Network and on the Northern Isles Ferry Services Network to support economic, social and cultural development of our island and remote mainland communities. This Government works closely with ferry operators to try and ensure demands on our ferry services are met, and in line with the vessel replacement and deployment plan, a number of initiatives are being taken forward to ensure that future capacity challenges are met and that ferry services are further developed.
Donald Cameron.
The Minister may be aware of recent reports that distilleries on Islay have recently raised concerns about ferries that serve that island regarding the available space on vessels, not just for commercial reasons but also because of the vital tourism which the whisky industry brings. What action is the Scottish Government taking to improve the situation on Islay and elsewhere?
Minister.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The introduction of the road equivalent tariff has brought significant and continuing benefits to Islay. The member has indicated obviously there's increasing demand on the capacity that serves Islay. We're very much aware of that, and forecast growth in 35% growth in demand from the distilling sector alone will put additional pressure on the capacity we have serving Islay. We have discussed with the Islay Ferry Committee and Mr Russell as a local member, happy to discuss with Mr Cameron similar issues and how we try and respond to that demand long term. And Islay is of course the next location that we're looking to provide a new vessel to serve, and we've had discussions also with other ferry operators including Western Ferries who've raised interest in that area too. So we are trying to do everything we can to get all options to improve ferry capacity to serve the very important community in Islay and make sure their economic aspirations can be met.
And Alistair Allen.
The Minister will be aware of the importance of upgrading CalMac's booking system to allow better management of capacity, not least during times of disruption. Is the Minister able to provide an update on progress in this area?
Minister.
I certainly can. I first of all want to recognise that this was a very important issue, Presiding Officer, raised by a summit that was chaired by Dr Allen and Ewing, and I'm grateful to him for hosting that event last November. And I can confirm that this is an area that I've requested Transport Scotland officials prioritise in their discussions with CalMac. Indeed, proposals for the introduction of smart ticketing, as outlined by CalMac in their tender bid for the Clyde and Hebrides service, is currently under discussion with Transport Scotland. I recognise that an updated system could provide significant benefits in terms of communication with customers and also to help with different packaging of tickets to try and incentivise use of the services.
Question number 9, Bill Kidd.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the Scottish Government whether the Fair Food Transformation Fund will continue to provide funding to community-based organisations beyond the 2019 tranche.
Cabinet Secretary Eileen Campbell.
Thank you. We are currently undergoing a review of the way in which organisations apply for funding through the Fair Food Transformation Fund and several other communities-related funds. As set out in the draft budget statement, we aim to launch a new single harmonised communities fund this year that will replace several current funding mechanisms, including the Fair Food Transformation Fund. This streamlined application process seeks to make things easier for third sector and community organisations, something we know the sector would value and has requested. My officials have been keeping in contact with organisations throughout this review and with those who are interested in applying to the fund, and will update them as soon as plans are finalised.
Bill Kidd.
Thank the Minister, the Cabinet Secretary, for that reply. Can the Cabinet Secretary outline what support may be given from the Scottish Government to food banks applying for funding who are looking to develop a wraparound food justice system, such as Drumchapel Food Bank in my own constituency, who also provide referrals to the health and social care services, including mental health and suicide prevention, local money advice services and interaction with local education services where appropriate?
Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, and I thank Mr Kidd for raising awareness of the incredible work that is going on in his constituency, because these are exactly the sort of activities that the current Fair Food Fund seeks to support, because these are activities which allow access to food in a dignified manner and provides that holistic, person-centred support that is clearly the hallmark of Drumchapel's approach. And I can confirm that the new Unified Fund will also endeavour to support that innovative work. But what an absolute pity, Presiding Officer, to have to deal with increasing levels of food insecurity that only now the UK Government has finally conceded is down to their appalling rollout of universal credit.
Thank you very much, and that concludes general questions. Before we move on to First Minister's questions, could I invite members to join me in welcoming to our gallery Dr Hassam Zomlot, Palestinian Head of Mission to the UK. Thank you. We turn now to First Minister's questions. Question number 1, Jackson Carlow.
Scotland doesn't want to be in a separate currency. Does the First Minister agree?
First Minister.
Well, I think Scotland should have the ability to choose the arrangements on currency and on everything else that best suit our needs and interests. That's the very essence of independence, and it's why I and an increasing number of people in Scotland support Scotland becoming an independent country. But can I say to Jackson Carlow, I am always delighted to talk about independence, but there is a constitutional issue that is, I think, more immediately pressing right now. In just 22 days, 3 weeks tomorrow, Scotland is due to be taken out of the EU against our will. There is still no sign of an agreement on withdrawal issues, no guarantee of a transitional phase, and no clarity on our future relationship. So can I give Jackson Carlow another chance to say something that people might actually want to hear? Will he join with me today in demanding that the Prime Minister stops asking people to choose between catastrophe and disaster, and instead takes a no-deal Brexit off the table now?
Jackson Carlow.
It's the First Minister's own deputy who has raised the issue of currency this week. Scotland doesn't want to be in a separate currency. I was quoting the First Minister herself just a few short years ago when she and her predecessor were telling us that it was Scotland's pound and nobody was going to take it. Who would have thought, 5 years on, that the only people who want to take away Scotland's pound would now be the SNP? This week we've learned from the SNP's deputy leader their new plan is to ditch the pound and set up a completely new and untried currency. So, First Minister, any homeowner who has a mortgage in pounds and overnight their salary is paid in a new untried currency, are mortgage payments going to go up or down?
First Minister.
Well, of course, until a democratically elected Scottish Parliament in an independent Scotland decided to change that, people would continue to use the pound, which of course is Scotland's currency, just as it is the currency of anywhere else in the UK. But Jackson Carlaw confidently talks about what people in Scotland want. Well, you know, the way to determine what people in Scotland want, that's to allow them to choose in a referendum. And of course, the Tories are so scared that people would choose independence at the next time of asking that they want to block them having that choice. That is deeply anti-democratic. But I think people watching this exchange today, I'm afraid to say to Jackson Carlaw, are thinking about what is due to happen 3 weeks tomorrow. So let me bring him back to the here and the now. 3 weeks tomorrow, this country is due to be taken out of the EU against our will. We still do not know whether there will be a transition phase, and we do not know anything about the future relationship with the EU. That uncertainty could be removed today if the Prime Minister rules out no-deal Brexit. So I'll give him another opportunity. Will he join with me today and call on the Prime Minister to end this uncertainty and to rule out a no-deal Brexit at any time? Yes or no?
Jackson Carlaw.
The problem is this First Minister just doesn't listen. There is no majority support for a second independence referendum. And if the currency were changed, here's what would happen. The Fraser of Allender Institute made clear on ITV Border this week, people would still be tied into mortgages or car loans, but they'd be paying them off in an untried, unknown, as yet unnamed new currency. A clear risk of people paying more. That's the plan your deputy leader launched this week. Worse still, today we read in the papers that the First Minister's deputy is also plotting another referendum on independence, no matter whether it's legal or not. Another independence referendum is the last thing Scotland needs. So irrespective of the views of her errant deputy, will the First Minister rule out this divisive plan?
First Minister.
The legal basis for the next independence referendum should be the same as the basis for the last independence referendum. And the only reason we are talking about this issue is the disgracefully anti-democratic stance of the Conservatives, who refuse to recognise a mandate won at not just one election, but 2 elections and endorsed by this Parliament. But, Presiding Officer, we can always tell when the Tories are in trouble, because pantomime Jackson Carlaw makes a reappearance. The face gets red, the arms get waved about. The fact of the matter is, people in Scotland will have ample opportunity to talk about the many benefits of becoming an independent country. But we don't have too much longer to sort out the mess of Brexit. So I'm going to give him yet another opportunity. 22 days. 3 weeks tomorrow at midnight, Scotland is due to be taken out of the EU, and we still don't know what follows from that. That could be taking away, that uncertainty, if a no-deal Brexit is ruled out. So for once in his life, will Jackson Carlaw stand up to his bosses at Westminster, and will he join with me in calling, demanding that the Prime Minister rules out a no-deal Brexit and that she does it now with no further delay?
Jackson Carlaw.
The whole chamber knows that in 2 short years, Ruth Davidson will be sitting where the First Minister sits today. And a Scottish Conservative First Minister will be answering questions for a long time to come. But for the moment, this First Minister remains in office. So in summary, the SNP is preparing to launch a new currency, according to their Deputy Leader, which would throw people's mortgages and Scotland's economy into chaos. Then, according to her Deputy Leader, with whom she's now disagreeing publicly, the SNP plan to launch an illegal referendum within a matter of weeks. Another week of the SNP showing that there is only one priority for this government, and that's satisfying Nicola Sturgeon's obsession with a second independence referendum. Enough is enough. First Minister, order. Just rule it out and let Scotland move on.
First Minister.
Well, at the start of that latest chapter in the pantomime, Jackson Carlaw actually had the good grace to laugh at himself. He was being so utterly ridiculous. I was going to say Jackson Carlaw has lost the plot. I'm not sure he ever had the plot in the first place. But let me tell Jackson Carlaw what my obsession is right now. It's saving Scotland from the disaster of a Tory Brexit. Now, I don't know how Jackson Carlaw plans to spend the rest of his day. Let me tell him how I'll be spending the rest of my day. This afternoon, I will be chairing a meeting. Jackson Carlaw might want to listen to this. I will be chairing a meeting of the Scottish Government's Resilience Committee. And what we will be looking at is how just 3 weeks from now, 3 weeks tomorrow, we can secure medicine supply in Scotland, how we can secure food supply, make sure people in Scotland still have food on their table. We will be looking at how we can protect our economy from the risk of being plunged into recession. All of that time, all of that effort, all of that expense, because a Tory Prime Minister refuses to rule out a no-deal Brexit. It is shameful that the Scottish Conservatives have not demanded that she do so. You know, I've been wondering why the Scottish Tories are
First Minister,
as supine as they are. Perhaps it's because, Presiding Officer, they don't want to stand up for Scotland and never will stand up for Scotland.
Question number 2, Richard Leonard.
An independent Scotland will keep the pound because it is in everyone's best interests, and to try and suggest otherwise flies in the face of the facts. That's what Nicola Sturgeon said in 2013. First Minister, if that was true then, why isn't it true now?
Can I have some quiet, please, for the questions and the answers? Nicola Sturgeon.
Well, let me just share a quote with the Chamber. People in Scotland need a strong party of Labour that speaks for working class people and working class communities, and they are not doing that. Richard Leonard's strategy is a recipe for failure. That's Gary Smith from the GMB on Scottish Labour. So maybe it's about time Scottish Labour stopped being a pale echo of the Scottish Conservatives and actually started standing up for Scotland as well.
Richard Leonard.
Well, I didn't discern an answer in that. So let me ask another question. Last night, the SNP Finance Minister, Kate Forbes, told the BBC the currency you used the day before independence will be the same currency you use the day after independence. But under your plans, First Minister, that simply isn't true, is it? Because what Kate Forbes left out last night, and what you've left out in your answer, is that you plan to use the pound without a central bank. It's the SNP's very own no-deal exit. And that would mean building up substantial foreign exchange reserves. The Finance Secretary, Derek Mackay, could not tell this chamber yesterday afternoon how much that would cost. but the people of Scotland deserve an answer. So this afternoon, can the First Minister provide us with an answer?
First Minister.
The position of Labour and the Tories on these questions is utterly ridiculous. Remember in 2014, they told us an independent Scotland couldn't use sterling in a currency union. Now they tell us we can't use sterling without a currency union, and they tell us we can't have our own currency as well. Scotland must be the only country in the entire world that couldn't have any currency. It is ridiculous, and the people of Scotland know that. So let me tell Richard Leonard exactly what the position is.
Order, please.
Will be in an independent Scotland. Until a democratically elected Scottish Parliament decides otherwise, we will use the pound, which is our currency, just as it is the currency of other parts of the UK. But again, Richard Leonard is asking questions about independence. I'm happy to talk about independence any day, but people across Scotland are worried right now about Brexit. And yesterday we had a member of his backbenches telling us that he is so desperate that he's actually trying to stop his own party conference openly debating Brexit. So will Richard Leonard join with me now, not just in calling for no deal to be ruled out, but calling for people to have a chance again to reject Brexit? Will he do that today?
Richard Leonard.
Yes, I will do that, and I said that on Tuesday afternoon. But the answer, presiding officer, to the question I asked is that £40 billion of foreign exchange reserves would be required. And that's before we look at the reserves needed to ensure bank deposits. And that's before Derek Mackay's austerity programme to halve the deficit in 5 years. That's not just a programme for austerity, that's a programme for turbocharged austerity at the very time when the people are crying out for investment. First Minister, this isn't about the best interests of the people of Scotland, is it? It's just about the best interests of the SNP.
First Minister.
If Scotland was independent right now, we wouldn't be facing 3 weeks tomorrow being taken out of the European Union against our will. Right now, it is because Scotland is not independent that we have to put up with a Tory government that we didn't vote for. It is because Scotland is not independent that we face being ripped out of the European Union against our will. And perhaps until Richard Leonard and the Scottish Labour Party find it within themselves to stand up for Scotland instead of standing up for the continuation of Tory rule, they will never recover in Scotland, and they will never deserve to recover in Scotland.
Thank you. We've got some constituency supplementary questions. The first from Angus MacDonald, to be followed by Jeremy Balfour. Angus MacDonald.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The First Minister will be aware that yesterday administrators were called into Grangemouth haulage firm Duncan Adams, which has operated in the port for nearly 60 years. 132 employees were made redundant yesterday following the devastating news, with 12 being retained short-term to assist with the closure of the firm. The priority in the immediate term clearly must be focused on supporting the staff and their families through this difficult period. Falkirk Council have been in touch with Skills Development Scotland regarding pay support, and Unite the Union have arranged an advice session for the workforce on Sunday. Will the First Minister help to ensure everything possible is done to provide follow-up support to the families affected, and also ensure plans are in place to avoid a backlog of containers at the port of Grangemouth?
First Minister.
Can I thank Angus MacDonald for raising this important issue. I was very concerned to learn of this development at Duncan Adams Haulage and the impact that this will have on the workers there, their families, and of course the surrounding communities. I can confirm that through our PACE initiative, we have already been in contact with the administrators who have agreed to issue PACE guides to all 144 employees. PACE representatives will also attend the meeting on the 10th of March at the Lee Park Hotel in Grangemouth, which has been organised by Unite the Union and which is open to all redundant employees. The local PACE team is considering what further support can be provided, and I can also confirm that we are in touch with the Port Authority to assess the impact on port operations, and I'll be very happy to ask the Minister involved to keep Angus MacDonald fully updated.
Jeremy Balfour, to be followed by Tavish Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. To ask the First Minister if she would agree with me that no decision should be made by the City of Edinburgh Council to extend the Edinburgh Tram network until the findings of the Edinburgh Tram inquiry is published and all lessons learned.
First Minister.
Well, I think decisions of City of Edinburgh Council are actually for City of Edinburgh Council to take, and I'm sure they will take account of all relevant factors. It's important that the inquiry concludes. It's important that any lessons that come from that inquiry are learned. But I know the Scottish Conservatives used to be in favour of localism. They used to demand that the Scottish Government did more to support localism. So I'm going to do that today, even if they've changed their mind, and say that matters for the City of Edinburgh are for the City of Edinburgh to determine.
Tavish Scott, to be followed by Bob Doris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Air traffic controllers employed by a company owned by the government and who operate across the Highlands and Islands plan to strike next month. I'm sure the First Minister will recognise that that would stop air travel and would create tremendous disruption for passengers across the network, including those potentially flying to hospitals for hospital appointments. Could she set out to the Parliament what her government have done on this matter and what they now plan to do to make sure this strike does not happen?
First Minister.
Well, it is, of course, disappointing to hear about planned strike action. Highlands and Islands Airport, of course, is covered by our public sector pay policy. HIAL has implemented a pay rise for all staff, which is a significant improvement on previous years. They've also significantly increased their contribution to the pension scheme in order to maintain this benefit for employees. In addition, ministers have authorised HIAL to develop a retention allowance as part of the Air Traffic Management 2030 strategy programme. I hope we can see strikes avoided, and I would encourage the Union and HIAL to continue to work together to resolve the outstanding issues.
Bob Doris, to be followed by Alex Rowley.
Presiding Officer, the announcement of 120 redundancies and looming closure of Gemini Rail in my constituency is a devastating blow for a skilled and dedicated workforce. Gemini Rail have been unflexible, unimaginative and slow to engage meaningfully in our efforts to retain jobs and operations. Will the First Minister commit to continuing to explore all options to support workers to retain jobs and operations at the site, on which point, First Minister, I would stress that if Springburn was to win the ScotRail 170 class tender, work that Gemini Rail have staggeringly still failed to bid for, it would provide 30 jobs for 3 years and potentially kick-start a railway hub model that the Scottish Government is currently exploring.
First Minister.
Well, can I again pay tribute to Bob Doris for the way in which he is representing the interests of his constituents, and agree very much with the latter point that he made. I was extremely disappointed to receive a letter from Gemini Rail yesterday confirming the closure of the workshops at Springburn, and I know this will be a very concerning time for workers there and their families. However, and I want to stress this point, we believe that consideration does still need to be given to potential options for keeping the site open. There will be a further meeting of stakeholders at the end of this month to discuss the way forward. The workshops have work to complete on vehicles leased to ScotRail until July this year, and Gemini Rail has retained the lease until March next year. So that means there is time to work with industry with a view to repurposing the site for future rail use, and to that end Scottish Enterprise has already engaged independent financial advice in reviewing Gemini Rail's model for the site, and we will keep members fully updated with any progress.
And Alex Rowley.
Presiding Officer, the BBC are reporting this morning that BIFAB has lost out for offshore platforms to yards in Belgium, Spain and the United Arab Emirates. The Unite and GMB unions are calling for a committee of inquiry in this Parliament. They say billions of pounds worth of contracts and thousands of direct and indirect jobs are going to be lost, and they are now on the brink of being lost to state-sponsored companies and companies who hold an unfair commercial advantage, or economies which do not apply labour standards which we would recognise. This is not a level playing field. What further steps will the Scottish Government take to secure long-term future for the Fife Yards, and do you accept that we need more direct state intervention to ensure a just transition in our economy?
First Minister.
Yes, I do agree with that last point, which is why, of course, we've established a Just Transition Commission in Scotland on the recommendation, indeed, of the STUC. I think it's important also to recognise that, notwithstanding the very real challenges that are being faced, BIFAB today wouldn't even exist had it not been for Scottish Government intervention. And although there are big challenges for the Fife Yards, of course, we had the good news about Arnish earlier this week. Can I say, though, and I
indicated some of this last week. I absolutely share the concerns that have been expressed by Gary Smith of GMB and Pat Rafferty of Unite the Union. The concerns that BIFAB may be facing unfair challenges in securing other contracts. I want the Scottish Government to work with the unions to fully explore that. I intend to convene a summit in early course to do so. We've worked extremely well with the unions and intend to continue doing so. And in the interim, of course, we will continue to do everything we can with the unions and with the owners of the yard. Of course, the Scottish Government has a stake in the yard. We will do everything we can to help secure work, not just for Arnish, but for the 2 yards in Fife as well. And I hope we will have the support of the whole chamber as we do so.
Question number 3, Alison Johnson.
Thank you. Young people are twice as likely to be injured on our roads. Now, some parts of Scotland have made their streets safer, healthier places, including here in Edinburgh, where a 20-mile-per-hour speed limit has been rolled out across the city, and in Fife too, where more lives are being saved and children protected from injury, particularly in low-income areas. Does the First Minister share my concerns that too many communities aren't benefiting from this small change that would make a big difference when it comes to tackling the health inequality that continues to blight Scotland?
First Minister.
Well, firstly, can I take the opportunity to welcome Alison Johnson to FMQs? I think it's great to have her asking questions. Firstly, I do recognise and share her concern about the statistics that she has cited today. Many local authorities, of course, already have 20-mile-an-hour speed limits in certain areas, and I would encourage local authorities to consider that where they think it is appropriate. Of course, there is, I understand, members' legislation about to come through this Parliament, and of course the Parliament will debate that, and the Scottish Government will continue to listen to all of the arguments that are made.
Alison Johnson.
Thank you. I appreciate the First Minister's response. The Scottish Government has made some brave and important public health interventions around banning smoking in public places, introducing a minimum price for alcohol. But these policies are effective because they apply at a national level with government leadership. I think the piecemeal approach won't deliver what I know both I and the First Minister want, which is all children to have safe streets. So the health and safety of our children can't depend on which part of the country they live in. So will the First Minister join organisations including NHS Health Scotland and the Royal College of Paediatric and Child Health and back my colleague Mark Ruskell's 20-mile-per-hour bill, a public health measure that will have the greatest impact where it's most needed?
First Minister.
I can give an assurance that we will listen very carefully to the arguments that are made as Mark Ruskell brings forward his bill, and I would commend him for raising this issue in the way that he is doing. I think Alison Johnson is right, and this is an issue that in government we grapple with all the time, showing national leadership on an issue, which, as Alison Johnson has said, we have done on a range of public health issues in particular, but also respecting the autonomy of local councils, which is something people across this chamber call for on a regular basis. So it's important that we do get that balance right, but paramount importance, of course, has to be attached to the safety of children. So I absolutely commit to listening carefully to these arguments, as I'm sure members across the chamber will do, so that I would very much hope the Parliament reaches the right decision on this that gets that balance right.
Some further supplementaries. The first from George Adam, to be followed by Maurice Corrie. George Adam.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Is the First Minister aware that Global Radio, who operate Heart, Capital and Smooth Radio in Scotland, plan to create a virtual radio network to compete with BBC Radio 1 and Radio 2 using local licences to do so? Does the First Minister agree with me that Ofcom must become involved and keep local commercial radio in Scotland local?
First Minister.
Well, I'm a great supporter of and fan of local radio, so I think its place in our broadcasting environment is very, very important. So I hope Ofcom would take into account all of the very reasonable points that George Adam has just made.
Maurice Corrie, followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. On Monday this week, my constituent, Mr Phillips, an Armed Forces veteran, collapsed from a suspected stroke. He waited just under 6 hours for an ambulance to arrive at his home Milngavie, after which he was taken to the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital, where he waited a further 5 hours before he was seen by a doctor. He spent the night in the receiving unit as there were no beds available. Does the First Minister agree with me that this is an unacceptable level of time for anyone to wait for an ambulance and an assessment from a doctor, let alone someone who has suffered a stroke? And will she look into the matter with the utmost urgency?
First Minister.
Yes, I do agree that on the basis of what the member has narrated, that is unacceptable, and if he wants to provide greater detail of his constituent's case, the Health Secretary will be very happy to look into that. What I'm about to say does not take away from that particular case and the unacceptability of what's just been described, but of course our ambulance service do a fantastic job day in and day out, and our accident emergency services, although they face considerable challenges, remain the best performing accident emergency services anywhere in the UK, and I think all of the staff who work so hard to deliver that performance deserve our grateful thanks, but we'd be very happy to look into the individual circumstances.
Willie Rennie, to be followed by Jenny Mara.
This morning, the UK Statistics Authority reprimanded the First Minister for the misuse of statistics in response to my question to her at last week's First Minister's questions on NHS waiting times. The letter states, waiting times are a major concern to patients and their families. The statistics informing debates about them must therefore be trustworthy, of suitable quality and useful. We are therefore extremely disappointed that it has been necessary for us to intervene in this way. This is the second time that this has happened recently. Will the First Minister therefore take the opportunity to apologise to the Chamber and to the country for misusing statistics in this way?
First Minister.
I will, as the Government always will, reflect very carefully on anything that the Office for Statistics Regulation says. The statistics that I used were accurate, and as I understand it, they are statistics that are available to anybody on request, and statistics that will be published by ISD. Of course, it's not the Scottish Government that decides what statistics ISD publish and don't publish. They decide that, and I hope we can have as much transparency and as many comprehensive statistics as possible, because that would demonstrate that, of course, the NHS is, in so many different measures, the best performing NHS anywhere in the UK.
Jenny Mara, to be followed by Shona Robertson.
Presiding Officer, there are still electrical apprentices from McGill, the firm that went into administration after failure of this government to provide a modest loan. There are still apprentices in Dundee trying to salvage their apprenticeships. This country's skills situation cannot afford to lose apprentices, and I am not convinced that Skills Development Scotland, from the representation I've had from constituents, are doing all they can. Can she guarantee me today that her minister will follow up every McGill apprentice to make sure that they secure another place to complete their apprenticeships?
First Minister.
Well, we will do everything, as we always do in redundancy situations, to make sure that apprentices are placed and are able to continue their apprenticeship. Skills Development Scotland works extremely hard to do that, and if Jenny Mara knows of anybody who needs further assistance, then she should bring those people to us so that we can ensure that that assistance is there. But this, of course, is Scottish Apprenticeship Week, and right across the country, people have been celebrating the success of Scotland's apprenticeship programme. A few years ago, there were something like 10,000 modern apprentices in Scotland. Today, that is 27,000 as we work towards a 30,000 target. So this is a success story, and we will continue to do everything we can. When companies regrettably fail, we will continue to do everything we can to make sure that apprentices do not pay the price of that, and that is an absolute commitment that this Scottish Government will always honour.
And Shona Robertson.
Does the First Minister share my concern that in the week that we celebrate International Women's Day, we've seen the creation of a video game entitled Rape Day, which enables players to verbally harass, kill and rape women as they progress through the story? While it's positive news that the gaming platform Steam has decided not to distribute and sell this game, does the First Minister agree with me that we should send out a clear message to other game developers and platform providers that such games have no place in our society in this day and age? And does she think it's time for the UK Government to review the regulation in this area?
First Minister.
Yes, I do, and can I pay tribute to Shona Robertson for highlighting this issue this week. The Rape Day video game is absolutely sickening and appalling. Violence against women, sexual or any other form of violence against women, is not a game and should never be treated in such a way.
It is serious and must be treated in that way, so I hope this game is not promoted, but this shouldn't be down, in my view, to the individual decisions of companies. I do think it is time for the regulations governing this to be reviewed, and perhaps this is something the whole Chamber could unite on and call on the UK Government to do without any delay.
Question number 4, Keith Brown.
To ask the First Minister what the Scottish Government's response is to the UK Government's Stronger Towns Fund.
First Minister.
Well, to be honest, it's hard to know what a response should be, because the UK Government has been unable to confirm any details of the funding implications of this announcement for Scotland. We will continue to press the UK Government to ensure that Scotland receives its fair share of any additional funding. As with so many things related to Brexit, the UK Government's plans are, frankly, as clear as mud, but they do suggest that Scotland is continually being shortchanged.
Keith Brown.
Can I thank the First Minister for her response and acknowledge the point she makes about so much of it being unclear, but does she share my concerns about the exclusion of Scotland and Wales from the Prime Minister's Brexit bung? And does she agree with me that this is yet another example of the failing fiasco of Tory Brexit, which one of their own Tory Cabinet Ministers said was like hitting an iceberg, and which is only surpassed by the complete inadequacy of the 13 Tory MPs from Scotland, each of whom represent a constituency that voted to remain in the UK, and their failure to stand up for Scotland?
First Minister.
Well, these points are important. Not only do we have no clarity on the Stronger Towns Fund or whether Scotland will get any share, let alone a fair share of that, we still have no clarity regarding the future of structural funds, or the so-called Shared Prosperity Fund. We've also heard that the UK Government is to provide an additional £140 million to Northern Ireland, but with no indication of equivalent consequential funding for Scotland or for Wales. Now, we welcome the additional funding for Northern Ireland, but there must be confirmation that Scotland and Wales will be treated fairly. Of course, in sharp contrast to the Brexit bung of the Prime Minister this morning, the Scottish Government has announced the projects that will benefit from our £20 million Regeneration Capital Grant Fund. Not money to persuade anybody to vote for anybody, just money to ensure the regeneration of communities the length and breadth of Scotland. That's a government getting on with the day job, and the UK Government could learn lots of lessons from us.
Question number 5, Rachel Hamilton.
To ask the First Minister what action the Scottish Government is taking to help people who have bipolar disorder.
First Minister.
Bipolar disorder is, of course, a very serious mental illness, and we want everyone in Scotland to have access to effective mental health services when they need them. That's why we've set out in our programme for government a £250 million package of measures to do more to support positive mental health and prevent ill health. The funding for a package of new measures comes in addition to £150 million of investment over 5 years already underway to support delivery of the mental health strategy. And in addition, we're providing support to Bipolar Scotland, which provides information, support and advice for people affected by bipolar disorder and those who care for them.
Rachel Hamilton.
I thank the First Minister for that answer. Bipolar disorder patients in Scotland are receiving treatments such as antidepressant monotherapy that are at best ineffective and at worst detrimental for long-term outcome, according to Professor Daniel Smith from Glasgow University. Lithium prescribed on its own is the recommended first-line treatment for bipolar disorder because of its proven effectiveness in preventing episodes of depression and mania. However, it is prescribed to only 1 in 20 patients. Can I ask the First Minister what action her government is taking to address this important issue? Would she agree with Alison Cairns, the Chief Executive of Bipolar Scotland, that we need to see more patient-clinician partnerships in Scotland?
First Minister.
Yes, I do agree with that. The Scottish Government expects all patients with bipolar disorder to have access to appropriate and evidence-based treatments, with individual prescribing decisions, of course, made by clinicians, but made in partnership with their patients. We've set a national standard in Scotland to outline the monitoring requirements of people treated with lithium, and details of that were sent to Health and Care Services in June 2017. And using that benchmark, we can improve the quality of care and treatment we provide, improve patient safety and reduce what is an established health inequality. Individual health boards, of course, will determine how best to undertake this monitoring, but it is very important that it is done.
Question number 6, Daniel Johnson.
First Minister, whether the merger of Police Scotland and the British Transport Police has been permanently abandoned.
First Minister.
Well, we remain committed to the devolution of railway policing as agreed by all parties in this Parliament during the Smith Commission. We've worked with stakeholders on options to improve the accountability of railway policing in Scotland. There is consensus that legislation currently enforced could be used to create an arrangement that facilitates a stronger role for the Scottish Police Authority. The SPA and the British Transport Police Authority are considering how this should be done, and they aim to present proposals to their respective boards in the coming months. It would be premature to rule out any option at this time, but any proposal must enhance the accountability of railway policing in Scotland while ensuring the safety and the security of the travelling public.
Daniel Johnson.
Thank you, and I thank the First Minister for that response. But after almost 2 years and hundreds of thousands of taxpayers' pounds being spent trying to find a way of achieving integration of BTP into Police Scotland, it is clear to everyone, if not the First Minister, that it's simply not possible. The uncertainty that staff and officers have faced will not end until full integration is permanently ruled out. So can I ask the First Minister to take the opportunity now to go beyond the letter that was sent to staff and officers this week saying that they will not transfer, and confirm that this plan for full integration has been permanently scrapped? And actually, will she take the opportunity to confirm when the repeal of the fatally flawed Railway Policing Act Scotland will take place?
First Minister.
Well, I think as Daniel Johnson recognises, this is a challenging piece of work. It's a complex piece of work, and considerable work has been done to assess all of the risks and challenges. We've engaged with stakeholders throughout this process. A stakeholder engagement event was held in November to explore all options. The option currently developed, of course, will see a new committee established to oversee railway policing in Scotland, which would comprise members of both the Scottish Police Authority and the British Transport Police Authority. Both of those authorities have been working closely on the proposed terms of reference for that new committee. They're making good progress on that, and it's hoped they'll be in a position to present proposals to the respective boards in the coming months. And I'll give an undertaking today that the Cabinet Secretary will update Parliament once those negotiations are concluded. So I think that's the right way to proceed, to make sure that we have arrangements in place that do enhance the accountability of railway policing in Scotland, which I hope all members would want to see, but also ensuring the safety and security of the travelling public, and of course those who work on in our transport police as well.
Liam Kerr, to be followed by Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. At the outset, I would like to thank all the officers, staff, experts, academics and colleagues from across the Chamber for forcing the SNP to concede that erecting a border on Britain's railways is a dreadful idea. But can the First Minister tell us how much taxpayers' money has been wasted pursuing full integration thus far? And will she admit that control room infrastructure cannot be replaced on the cheap?
First Minister.
Well, at least we know we have trains. When the UK Tory government let contracts for ferries, they don't check that they have ferries to do it. But seriously, I mean, this is a serious issue, and I would also pay tribute to those who work in our transport police. But the Tories here are not exactly in a consistent position. The Tories in their 2016 Scottish election manifesto actually advocated merger. Let me quote it. "We will create a national infrastructure police force bringing together the Civil Nuclear Constabulary, the Ministry of Defence Police and the British Transport Police to improve the protection of critical infrastructure." So the idea that the Tories have always supported retaining the British Transport Police as a standalone entity is, I'm afraid, not supported by the evidence or the facts. So that is the case. We will continue to take this forward in a proper way. I think the work that is being done now is extremely solid, and when that is concluded, the Cabinet Secretary will come back to Parliament to update members in the usual way.
Liam MacArthur, to be followed by John Mason.
Thank you very much. A recent academic paper by Dr Kath Murray and Dr Colin Atkinson concluded, while cutting losses at this stage will carry short-term political and reputational consequences, such a decision would stem the escalating financial, professional and personal costs. Years were wasted on the full integration model. So why will the First Minister not take this opportunity now to rule out that option for good?
First Minister.
Well, I've already set out to the Chamber, as the Cabinet Secretary has done previously, the work that is being done to get to the right solution, and I think it's important that that work continues. But in the interest of balance, given that I've just done it with the Conservative manifesto, the Liberal Democrat manifesto in 2016 said they would, and I quote, transfer control of the British Transport Police to Police Scotland, but seek to retain the ring-fenced expertise of officers on transport-related matters. So I've read out the full extract. The fact of the matter is parties are not necessarily taking the same position now as they did previously, but that, of course, is history. What is important now is that we get this right, and we will continue to support the work that has been done to ensure that that happens.
John Mason, to be followed by John Finney.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I wonder if the First Minister would accept that the ordinary constituents in my constituency do not understand why there should be one police force for the street outside the railway station and a separate police force for the railway station itself. And my ordinary constituents want a much more joined-up approach than we have had in the past.
First Minister.
Well, John Mason, I think, makes an important point. He makes an important point because whatever our individual views are on the best arrangements, I suspect most members of the public would simply want politicians to sort out the structures and the arrangements so that they can have confidence in their police wherever they need the services of those police. And of course, if there are, for example, terrorist incidents on our transport network, it will be often Police Scotland resources that are brought to bear to help with the resilience in those cases. So it is important that we have greater accountability for the British Transport Police, that we have as much integration around use of resources as possible, and that we put the right structures in place to support that. That is what we are working towards doing, and we are determined to get it right in the interest of everybody, those who work in the service and those who use the service as well.
And John Finney.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Does the First Minister share my concern that there are hundreds of police officers in Scotland here who can exercise the power of arresting our citizens, who can enter and search their premises, but they have no political accountability in Scotland?
First Minister.
Well, the point about accountability is one that I have made on several occasions already today. It is important to improve the accountability to the Scottish arrangements of the British Transport Police. That is one of the motivations behind the work that is underway and why it's important that we allow this work to reach a conclusion.
Thank you very much. And that concludes First Minister's questions. We're going to move on shortly to members' business in the name of Annabel Ewing on settled status scheme for EU citizens in Scotland. We'll just take a short suspension to allow members and ministers and the gallery to change seats. A short suspension.
Thank you. Can I ask the public leaving the public area to do so quietly as the Parliament
is still in session. The next item of business is a members' business debate on motion 15513 in the name of Annabel Ewing on settled status scheme for EU citizens in Scotland. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put, but I'd ask those members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Annabel Ewing to open the debate. Ms Ewing, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm very pleased indeed to have the opportunity to debate my motion on the UK Government's EU settlement scheme. And I do thank those members who have added their names in support and therefore facilitated this members' debate today. At the outset, can I just say that I find the UK Government's approach to EU nationals to be abhorrent. For as a matter of principle, it is forcing individual citizens who have legally acquired rights further to international treaty to make an application to the UK Government to seek to register in order to stay in the UK. That is to say, Presiding Officer, the UK Government is forcing EU citizens to apply for rights they already have. It is, Presiding Officer, nothing less than the othering of EU citizens living in our country, which othering policies students of history will know are not without risk to societal cohesion. And it is, Presiding Officer, nothing short of the blatant rewriting of history in terms of the role that the EU has played on these isles, UK membership dating back, of course, to 1973. But, Presiding Officer, these individuals, some 223,000 in Scotland and some 3.5 million across the UK as a whole, have been living in our country for years, and they have been contributing to the economic life of our country and to the social fabric of our country. They have paid taxes into the Exchequer, and they have paid national insurance contributions. They have their physical homes in our country, and they regard our country as home. Presiding Officer, EU nationals are our friends, they are our neighbours, they are our work colleagues, they are our fellow students, and they are, for many, in fact, family members. This week we heard of the heartbreaking story of Tovie MacDonald, further to an interview broadcast by STV. Tovie MacDonald is 87 years old. She was born in Denmark and has lived in Scotland for almost 60 years. She has children and grandchildren in Scotland. She was married here, she has friends here, and she has built her life here. But yet, the UK Government has written to Tovie MacDonald insisting that she apply in order to be able to stay in her own home. She described receiving this letter thus, Presiding Officer, and I quote, "I got a letter to say that because of Brexit, I had to register and I couldn't understand why. I thought this couldn't be right because I've been here for so many years. I thought it was absolutely crazy. It makes me feel very sad because this is my home and I feel more Scottish than Danish. I've got nowhere to go. This is my home." Who would ever have imagined that they would live to hear such a statement in 21st century Scotland? This is not who we are, Presiding Officer, and it is shaming for the UK Government and for Ruth Davidson's Tories in Scotland, who are happily going along with this. Indeed, not one Tory MSP has seen fit to sign my motion. Presiding Officer, the UK Government must now bring this sorry saga to an end and scrap this policy. It is of dubious legality and it must be viewed as motivated by the anti-immigration factions that are now rife inside the Tory party right across the UK. It is an ugly, heartless policy and it is causing considerable uncertainty, anxiety and distress. Some weeks ago, the UK Prime Minister, further to a concerted campaign by the SNP, by Scottish Labour, the Scottish Green Party and the Scottish Liberal Democrats, bowed to pressure to abolish the proposed settlement scheme fee, which was to be charged for each application. And I would urge all these parties to keep up the pressure and to work with the Scottish Government to see the end of this truly grotesque policy. And when doing so, it is worth highlighting that many concerns have been raised in any event about the mechanics of the scheme, including the unrealistic deadline for applications, the limited means by which applications can be made in general, and the ability of the already dysfunctional UK Home Office to administer the scheme. Concerns have also been raised by the House of Lords EU Justice Subcommittee about the fact that there will be no physical piece of paper if applications are successful, Rather, there will be an electronic link only. And given the UK government's record on IT and on competence in general, that will be a very chilling prospect for many people, Presiding Officer. Moreover, any delays in processing applications will have implications far beyond mere administrative issues. Indeed, they could result, as has been stated by the think tank British Future, in many thousands of EU citizens being left with an insecure immigration status or indeed no status at all. And it should be noted in this regard that deportations have not been ruled out by the UK Prime Minister and her Tory party. It must be asked, therefore, Presiding Officer, whether the UK government has willfully learnt no lessons at all from the Windrush scandal, a point made by Baroness Helena Kennedy in the House of Lords recently. Here in Scotland, the Scottish Government is doing all that it can within the limited powers that we have as far as immigration powers are concerned to help our fellow EU citizens. Specifically, Citizens Advice Scotland has been funded to provide a new advice service on rights, entitlements and requirements, which will be available across their network, with a solicitor-led helpline to be established for more difficult and complex cases. So here in our country, in Scotland, at this time of great uncertainty and anxiety, our government is committed to doing all it can to speak up for and support our EU citizens, while the Westminster government in London is forcing EU citizens to apply to retain the rights they already have. What a contrast, Presiding Officer, a contrasting tale of two governments that will not be lost on the people of Scotland. For we did not vote for this. We want no part of this, and we will not put up with this. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I would just wish to repeat what Scotland's First Minister said on the morning of the 2016 EU referendum result when speaking directly to citizens of other EU countries living in Scotland. She said, and I quote, "You remain welcome here. Scotland is your home and your contribution is valued." For my part, Presiding Officer, I would like to reiterate that message and would like to take this opportunity today to say to my constituents in Cowdenbeath, to all those EU citizens living in Cowdenbeath constituency and to all those EU citizens living across Scotland, you remain welcome here. Scotland is your home and your contribution is valued. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Ms Ewing. I call Tom Arthur to be followed by Alexander Stewart. Mr Arthur, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I wish to begin by thanking Annabel Ewing and recognising what was an excellent speech that brilliantly and in a very measured way, which can be challenging in debates like this, summarised the salient points. And I also want to recognise the outstanding contribution of EU nationals in my constituency of Renfrewshire South, EU nationals in Barrhead, Neilston, Uplemure, in Johnston, Elderslie, Linwood, Brookfield, Kilbarcan, Howwood, Lochwinnock, to those who volunteer in our third sector in Renfrewshire South, to those who work for Renfrewshire Council and East Renfrewshire Council, to those who work in our businesses and in our hospitality sector, to those in every area of our life, to our friends and our neighbours in Renfrewshire South, I want to recognise the EU nationals who work in this Parliament and make such an outstanding contribution. I want to recognise the contribution that all EU nationals across Scotland make. And I also want to make a point, because I'm not speaking about someone different when I say an EU national, because I am an EU national. I am an EU citizen, and I am proud to be an EU citizen. And I will fight to my dying breath to ensure that we maintain our EU citizenship, and that one day we will see an independent Scotland as a full member of the European Union, where we are all European citizens. Because, Presiding Officer, European citizenship is not some abstract, it's not some legalism. It was born out of the ashes of two calamities that befell the continent in the first half of the 20th century. The wisdom in EU citizenship, the wisdom in that shared identity came at the expense of the blood of countless millions of men and women and children across the continent. And if we forget that, if we allow ourselves to lapse into a rather numb, unthinking, bureaucratic state of mind, then that is a very dangerous place to get to, because it allows the insidious creep of intolerance, of the othering that Annabel spoke about. And I have to say, Presiding Officer. I so deeply regret that we are in this position today where we are having to debate this. But first and foremost, we must recognise the contribution that our EU friends, our brothers, our sisters, our neighbours, our co-workers, our families make to this country in enriching us. It was one of Europe's great authors, Marcel Proust, who said, "The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeing new landscapes, but in having new eyes." Well, within Europe, we do see new landscapes. We have the opportunity through freedom of movement to travel, but through mixing, through engaging, through that cultural exchange, we enhance ourselves, we develop ourselves, and we also see with new eyes. We become better people. Our EU citizenship enhances us, and that is the great gift that the European Union, that freedom of movement, and the ability for all EU citizens to live anywhere in this continent has bestowed upon us. There is something fundamentally different in a state of mind when you visit a country and go through passport control and know you have a mere 3 months where you can stay and you're a visitor. It's a fundamentally different state of mind for anyone in Scotland who can go to Paris, to Krakow, to Athens, to Madrid, to Lisbon, to any European capital, to any European city, and know they don't have the right just to visit, but to settle there, to live there, to work there. There becomes a sense of collective ownership and responsibility that binds our people together on this continent, that realises the vision of the founders of the European Union, which was to ensure that never again would this continent go to war. And when we start to unpick that tapestry that we have wove, that rich and ennobling tapestry that we have woven over the past 60 years, then we risk further down the line another catastrophe befalling our continent. And the reality is, a very practical reality for Scotland is that without EU nationals, we will not be able to build the fairer, more prosperous, more equal country that we all seek. We know the challenges facing Scottish public finances as a consequence of the demographics. The reality is that while within Scotland our working age population is just as productive as the working age population, indeed more so than many other parts of the UK, our population overall is ageing. And without that freedom of movement, without sending that message to citizens in Europe and indeed to across the world that they are welcome, we will not be able to build that better Scotland. So I want to conclude by thanking Annabel Ewing for bringing forward this motion, for thanking all those who signed it, and to say that we will continue to fight for our fellow EU citizens and to ensure that their citizenship is restored in full as members of an independent Scotland within the European Union.
Thank you, Mr Arthur. I call Alexander Stewart to be followed by Alec Rowley. Mr Stewart, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and can I thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, for allowing me to leave after my presentation and speech this afternoon, as I have individuals to meet, and then I'm coming back into the chamber to take the first question on rural economy after. I'm grateful for the opportunity to take part today, and I would like to acknowledge and congratulate Annabel Ewing for bringing this member's business debate to the chamber. I very much value the significant contribution that migrants to Scotland make to our economy, our culture and our everyday parts of life. Deputy Presiding Officer, regarding the EU settlement scheme, recommendations will be taken on board, which is why this scheme is initially launched as a pilot. During this time, the procedures will go through the prototype stage, just as any initial would go through in this process. There will be a strong enough options that particular procedures will, the scheme and the UK Government will listen to the options and act accordingly if appropriate, which is precisely why that has been done and the withdrawing of the application fee has been dealt with. Any person who has already applied during the pilot scheme will also have their fee reimbursed. The decisions made clear at... Okay.
Annabel Ewing.
I'm grateful to the member for taking the intervention. I hear that there's a pilot and it's moving to a scheme, and the UK Government may listen to some things, but it may not. Who knows? The fact of the matter is, though, there will be the EU settlement scheme. Why should EU citizens like Tove MacDonald, who has lived in this country for 60 years, be forced by the Tory government to apply for rights that she already has?
Alexander Stewart.
I acknowledge what Ms Ewing is saying, and I also acknowledge what the individual has made a representation. And I feel uncomfortable. I'm not denying the fact. about that situation, and I think that needs to be looked at because it has to be looked upon in a process. And I'm sure, and I continue, representation will be made, I have no doubt. Indeed, the nature of this, the permanent status of individuals and offering them the ability to come forward, I think is vitally important. So indeed, as the ability, as I said before, the UK government will continue to welcome the best and the brightest to this country. And I think that's vitally important that we do. However, as such schemes have been in the past, we had to identify the processes involved to ensure that we understand the benefits for both the host country and the applicant. Therefore, I, like others, am delighted that the UK government has abandoned its plans to change and charge EU citizens a fee when applying for the right to remain in Scotland through this settlement scheme. Governments in EU countries have already said that UK citizens living in other parts of the world will be treated in a similar way as to how the UK government treats EU citizens living in the UK, and this is rightly to be expected. It is interesting to note that the UK government has additionally researched and has agreements with non-EU countries like Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, as well as separate agreements with Switzerland. These countries are happy with the current arrangements, and the national of these countries have the ability to apply for EU settlement scheme from March the 30th, 2019. Presiding Officer, the new system of obtaining settled status will be streamlined, user-friendly, and will draw on existing government's data information that is a burden for applicants with evidence. Applications will not be refused on minor technicalities without unpacking and giving that appropriate and giving them the opportunity to refrigerate it. Caseworker consideration applications will exercise the reason on favour of the applicants where appropriate. And as a result, the Home Office has said it will expect a vast majority of cases to be granted, with refusals being most likely to be only on serious criminality and individuals who are not part. It is also important that we understand and we obtain, where we can, absent the UK, and individuals can stay outside the UK for 5 years without losing their settlement status. So I've already heard Ms Ewing make some comments, and there's no doubt that this is quite a volatile issue during the current negotiations. And I indicated right at the start that I and my party recognise the importance of the value of migrants coming to our country. Many have made their lives here and contribute to our business community, our academic and our political life. They are most welcome and to have that right to remain and should be treated with dignity and respect. And as I said, I think the case that Ms Ewing brings forward indicates that there's some way to go in managing that process. They have to, and they continue to make a significant contribution to the way of life that we have here. So I once again thank Ms Ewing for bringing this forward, and I look forward to seeing the processes that will be achieved in this subject, and that we all play our part to ensure the stability and the continuity of the subject going forward. Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Stewart. I call Alec Rowley to be followed by Stuart McMillan. Mr Rowley, please.
Presiding Officer, I welcome this debate today on the settled status scheme for EU citizens in Scotland. I was pleased to support the motion from Annabel Ewing, and I would want to associate myself with the speech that she made today. Although I do think it is ridiculous that the Tories have brought us to a place where it warrants discussion about something that seems so obvious. Those who live here in Scotland, work here in Scotland, have families here in Scotland and homes here in Scotland should clearly have an automatic right to remain, and should not and had never been subject to the proposal of the Tory government at Westminster of having to pay for the status and rights they currently already have. I'm glad this proposal was hastily scrapped by the Tories amid strong criticism from MPs and campaigning groups, although the fact it was proposed in the first place only shows to highlight how much of a mess the Tories are making when it comes to Brexit. The Labour Party would never have used peoples living in this country as a pawn in cheap negotiation tactics, and frankly it is shameful that they were ever treated in this way. EU citizens living in Scotland contribute greatly to our country, both culturally and economically. Diverse communities experience wide-ranging cultural benefits, especially through exchanges in ideas and customs, as well as making our world a more connected place. Migrants from the EU contribute £2,300 more to the Exchequer each year in net terms than the average adult. And over their lifetime, they pay in £78,000 more than they take out in public services and benefits. However, it is time we as a country started talking about immigration. It has become an almost taboo subject to raise, which has in turn resulted in those with extreme views capitalising on the lack of discussion and playing up to people's fears. We as a country need to talk about immigration and try to disperse the myths and indeed the fears people have around it. For it is the case here in Scotland that we need not less but more immigration. Scotland has an ageing population, and as a result of this, we will require more immigration in the future simply in order to sustain public services and support the increases in that elderly population. We only have to look at the Windrush scandal last year to see that our immigration system is broken. Theresa May has proposed a post-Brexit salary threshold for skilled immigrants at £30,000 level. This is just ridiculous, given that so many of our carers and NHS staff are migrants. How could we possibly maintain the level of services required when so many skilled workers will be blocked from working in the UK? We already are seeing our health service and social care systems struggling with funding problems. But if we remove access to a huge workforce resource, then what will that mean for those in need? Brexit has highlighted quite starkly that we as a country need to work on dispelling fears around immigration. But government has a huge role to play in this, and frankly the Tories have a lot to answer for in stirring up the rhetoric of fear in order to try and score political points. It is time, Presiding Officer, they stopped using people's lives in the way they have been and started standing up for our country as a whole. I'm happy to support the motion.
Thank you very much. I call Stuart McMillan to be followed by Jamie Green. Mr Green will be the last speaker in the open debate. Mr McMillan.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Presiding Officer, at the outset I'd like to thank my friend and colleague Annabel Ewing for securing this important debate. The campaign, which has been successful so far, proves that when parties actually work together, they can encourage and force some political change. Now, clearly in this Parliament, every party deserves some credit, except, that is, for the Conservatives. Now, the Tories, either willingly or just through some blind dogmatic approach, seem to have forgotten how important EU nationals actually are to Scotland and also to the rest of the UK. And it has been a complete and utter embarrassment to actually instigate this settled status fee. Now, Tom Arthur, in his contribution earlier on, spoke about the history of the EU project, and I can't agree with him any more on that, because it's so important to actually to understand and appreciate why the EU has came about and how important it actually was for that to be the case. Now, the fee was to be £65. Now, someone claimed that that wouldn't actually break the bank for many people, but, Presiding Officer, the fee could be 65 pence for all I'm concerned. It's not the issue of how much it was. It's about the messages sent out to people. It's sent out two things, two messages to EU nationals. First of all, they weren't wanted. And secondly, they were going to become a bargaining chip in the shambolic EU negotiations being led by the worst Prime Minister in history. They were to be used to tell the EU negotiators that they will be tough in the talks. Now, what the Prime Minister and her acolytes have done is actually to turn Britain into a laughingstock. Now, the so-called Great Britain that the Tories so proclaim that they actually support and love will actually have the reputation that isn't great across the EU and beyond. The Prime Minister and her revolving door of ministers, apart from Chris Grayling, of course, actually are telling people that Britain is uncaring. It was claimed that in the past that the UK's negotiating skills have reduced somewhat by becoming a member of the European Union. Now, it certainly appears to be true in this case. The EU isn't kicking us out, but the UK seems actually hell-bent on going out, leaving as sour a taste as possible,
to make things worse for the future. Sure.
Tom Arthur.
I wonder if Mr Macmillan would agree with me that a fitting motto for the UK government in the whole Brexit process would be "Stop the world, Britain wants to get off."
Stuart Macmillan.
I absolutely agree, Mr Arthur, absolutely agree. Now, Presiding Officer, who genuinely thought that imposing a charge on people who are our neighbours, our friends, our family members, our colleagues, our active members of society, teachers, nurses, doctors, engineers, footballers, rugby players and many, many more was a good thing? Who genuinely thought that by imposing a charge on EU nationals was actually going to build up some goodwill during the negotiations? Brexit is serious. It will have a huge effect upon the lives of everyone living in the 4 nations that currently make up the UK, as well as the people living in the EU 27. This isn't a game of chicken. These are real people with real lives and real futures. I don't for 1 minute think that all the Tories in this Parliament actually supported what was to be deployed. They will have toed the line to support the London Masters. Now, I get that, I understand the fact we've got internal party discipline. Every member in this chamber will get that. However, on something like this, forcing people who live here, and many of them have been here for decades, to actually pay for the privilege to remain in their own home, to remain with their families, to remain in their communities, to remain in their job, was the worst kind of dog whistle politics. Now, Scottish Tories didn't need to sign up to that. They could have been different, but they proved that whether it's in Scotland or whether it's across the UK, the nasty party is well and truly back. I truly welcome the U-turn by the Prime Minister on the £65 fee, but the damage has been done. I'm a firm believer that prevention is better than the cure. Every government will make mistakes, and this one was a howler of epic proportions. The sour taste will linger for many years, long after Brexit, and this is in addition to the Windrush scandal, telling the population that if you're different, you will remain different. That stinks and is deplorable. I understand why people are rightly angry, and I understand why people like former MSP Christian Allard were so vocal about this scandal. And every Tory who supported the scheme should hang their head in shame. And my final comment on this, Presiding Officer, is that the Tories need to apologise to our friends, our neighbours, and every EU national living and contributing to society, including to the staff of this Scottish Parliament. Thank you very much.
I call Jamie Green, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd had written a speech on today's date, but I've listened carefully to what members have to say, and I do accept some of what they're saying, because I think we as parliamentarians have a duty to work together on some of these issues. And, you know, we had a very lengthy debate about Brexit the other day, 4 hours of it in this Parliament, and yeah, there was a lot of theatre involved, but there was also a lot of sense come out of that as well. And my colleague Jackson Carlos stood in this podium here and spoke about some of the issues that Ms Ewing referred to around how people feel about this process. And I share his sentiment, I share Ms Ewing's sentiment on some of that. But I would like to explain why, and I did read the motion, there's lots to agree with it, but there are a few things that I don't. And if you would give me the benefit of explaining why I didn't sign the motion. And I'm not going to use the debate today to talk about Brexit as a wider issue, or EU citizenship and what it means to people who are Scottish or British or Scottish independence and what may or may not happen. I'd like to talk about specifically around the processes by which we achieve something that I think we all want to achieve, and that's securing the rights of EU citizens. I welcome the U-turn that was made on the fee. We didn't have any specific role to play in that policy. It was a Home Office decision. Did it sit uncomfortably with some members? Perhaps so. Was the decision to abolish it the right one? Yes, it was. But I do have this conundrum about the process by which we secure EU citizens' rights. Anyone who knows me, and any member from across the chamber that I have discussions about immigration with, including members of the government's front bench, will know that I think there's a positive case for inward immigration to Scotland, and there's a sensible conversation to be had around that. But those who are already here and those who wish to come here post 29th of March need to have some form of security and certainty that the process that they follow will give them the rights that they need, and indeed the ones that they already have. And let me explain why that's important to me. I've lived in Europe before. I've lived in Spain, in the Netherlands, in France. I've been through that process of turning up in a new country to live and work. But I've also been through the processes of those countries and respected their domestic processes to apply for residency in those places. The reason I went through that process is because I wanted to enjoy the benefits that they enjoyed of employment benefits, of being able to pay tax locally and be a meaningful part of their economies. I've had to apply for identity cards, registration of my citizenship there, and this is partially because of why we are where we are. We are not in Schengen. We do not have domestic ID cards or residency cards, and indeed no one else has ever left Europe before. So it was against that backdrop that we're in this conundrum of how do we guarantee the rights of those from outside a state of unions that we will no longer be a member of. The phraseology in the motion says that we want to scrap the settlement scheme. If we were to do so, and it is a question, which legal means do we have available to us to secure the rights of those who are already here? It is not an automatic process because the constitutional changes that will have taken place means there needs to be some form of process. I really have very little time, but maybe the Minister can sum up. Maybe the Minister, I've got a lot more to say if it's okay. I'm not refusing to take an intervention, for the record. Well, I'll take an intervention I've got
Ms.
time
Ewing,
to.
everything through the chair, please, and the member has absolutely every right not to take an intervention. He only has 4 minutes or thereabouts. It's a matter for him. Thank you. Please proceed.
I wish we had longer I would love to take an intervention, but I just simply don't have time. I want to point out that if this is the logic that there is no settlement scheme for EU residents in the UK, then surely we would be calling as a Parliament that there should be nothing for UK residents in Europe. Now, for example, Spain have offered reciprocal rights for UK nationals, but they've already said they will need to apply for something called a foreigner identity card. So what do we do as a Parliament? Do we welcome that because they've offered that reciprocal rights? Or do we condemn it because it involves a card, a process, or some form of registration? And that is the conundrum that we face. I want these bilateral agreements that secure UK rights in Europe, and I want to secure UK nationals' rights in the UK. But let's make sure that it's as simple and fair and respectful a process in both directions as it can and should be. There is much to agree within the motion today, but I cannot agree that there should be no process whatsoever, because I think if there were no process, it would make it difficult to actually secure the outcome that I think we collectively want to achieve, and that is securing the EU citizens' rights. Those who are already here, I want them to stay. I welcome them. I don't believe that anyone in the benches that I sit on do not want them to stay, and I think any suggestion otherwise is not just unfair, but deeply saddening. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Mr Green. And I call Ben McPherson to close to the Government Minister, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First of all, I too would like to congratulate Annabel Ewing on securing this incredibly important debate at this time. But I say that with regret, because Scotland is a remarkable European, outward-looking, welcoming country, and we shouldn't be having to have this debate. My message to EU citizens, as has been the message from the majority of speakers, is that Scotland is your home. You will always be welcome here. We want you to stay, and the Scottish Government will do all it can to support you to stay. And all of us can't say that enough to our EU citizen friends, neighbours, colleagues and loved ones. Presiding Officer, we must never lose sight of the fact that behind all the talk of amendments, withdrawal agreements, negotiations, the abolition of fees, people and their lives lie directly in this situation and are directly affected. People like Tovie MacDonald, who's been mentioned, who after 59 years of living in Scotland must now apply for the right to live in her home. An awful situation. And when I saw Tovie MacDonald's interview, I thought of so many others I've met and spoken to over recent months and years from Poland and Italy and France and other countries in the EU. Real people, real stories. People who have made their home here, who have brought up their families here, who pay their taxes, are valued members of their community, and yet now are being forced to apply for the right to stay in their home. This cannot be right. This is not right. In response to this, the Scottish Government is clear about the need to ensure that EU citizens feel valued and welcomed in Scotland. That has been at the heart of everything we have done since the EU referendum in 2016. Yet we are working against the backdrop of a narrative from the UK government that is deeply unhelpful, to say the very least. Their hostile environment policy is hurting people. Presiding Officer, before Christmas, this Parliament debated the rights of EU citizens. And one of our key asks in that debate was that the settled status fee should be abolished. An argument that was rejected at the time by the UK government. But soon after, from pressure from the Scottish Government, this Parliament, together with key partners such as the 3 million, we played a central role together in getting the fee for settled status scrapped. Yes.
Emma Harper.
Thank you. I've been sitting here listening to this debate, and I too am concerned for the many EU citizens in my South Scotland region. And you're talking about the settled scheme, and I'm also interested in the seasonal agricultural workers scheme that's been developed for the agricultural workers that are fruit pickers or vegetable pickers. But does the Minister recognise that the government's designing of the seasonal agricultural workers scheme has completely disregarded the dairy farms? 48% are in the southwest of Scotland, and it's not seasonal. They're all year round, and they don't even probably meet the Tier 2 £30,000 requirements to stay in this country.
Minister.
Thank the member for that question. The seasonal agricultural worker scheme is useful in some ways, but is absolutely inadequate and will certainly not be a substitute for freedom of movement. And that is why we in the Scottish Government are pressing the UK Government to rethink its white paper proposals, but are also putting forward proposals for flexibility within a UK framework within devolution in order to try and obtain solutions for Scotland in a post-Brexit environment, which of course we don't want to happen. We would prefer to maintain freedom of movement, but in the face of what's coming at us, we are trying our best to stand up for the interests of Scotland, including dairy farmers. Getting back to the settled status scheme, let me be clear that the scrapping of the fee was just a small concession from Westminster, because demanding that our colleagues, neighbours, friends and family pay to remain in their homes should never have been suggested in the first place. The proposal to charge a fee was always unacceptable, but it is not the only issue with the settled status scheme. EU citizens should not have to apply, and I noticed that one of the Tory speakers talked about the applicant a number of times. These are not applicants. These are people who are embedded in our communities and welcome parts of our country, welcome citizens in our country. People should not have to apply for the rights they already enjoy. And to answer one of the Conservative members' questions, instead they could have and should have been automatically granted status unless there was a very good reason not to. And the responsibility for obtaining this should not lie with individuals to apply, but with the UK government that has imposed this wrong-headed scheme. The UK government could have and should have chosen to secure EU citizens' rights as a priority after the vote for Brexit, separate to any withdrawal agreement. They could have done this, they could have led on this, and that would have been the right thing to do. I'll take the intervention.
Jamie Green.
Can I thank the Minister for the intervention? I hear what he's saying. Is it therefore, by that logic, the Scottish Government's official policy that the EU27 should give automatic residency to all UK nationals living in Europe at the moment without any form of process or registration? Is that his policy?
Minister.
My understanding is that this only became a live issue in the negotiations because it was one of the Prime Minister's red lines. And if the UK Government had shown leadership and ethical leadership as well by securing the rights of EU citizens, then she could have encouraged the EU remaining 27 to do the same. That should have been done years ago, and it certainly is something that we would back now. The security of EU citizens in all members of the European Union should be paramount, and we absolutely support that. Despite assurances from the Home Office that the settled status scheme would be simple with a presumption of acceptance, there are serious and mounting concerns about its operation. The UK Government has left a vacuum where it should be providing information, advice and support to EU citizens across the UK. Many EU citizens simply do not know that they need to apply because the UK Government has not done nearly enough to raise awareness of the scheme and provide much needed assistance with applications. That is why the Scottish Government in the weeks and months ahead will redouble its efforts to reach out and provide EU citizens with the information and support they need. We have already made provision for an advice and support service delivered through Citizens Advice Scotland, which will provide assistance over and above anything that the UK Government is doing, despite it being clearly their responsibility. But the concerns do not end there, Presiding Officer. The UK Government's insistence that all applications must be made online doesn't work for significant numbers of people. The issue with Apple devices not being able to be used for the scheme has been much debated. But for many people, it's not a question of which device they use. It is about having the digital skills and the confidence to trust your future to an online application. I know that many EU citizens are concerned about their ability to access services, housing and employment in the future. What I hear consistently is that many individuals want physical proof of their status, something that they can show to evidence their rights. The UK Government should listen and, in addition to the proposed electronic proof of status, provide individuals with a physical document evidencing their status. Again, this could have been proactively provided through a declarative process rather than an applicant process. Presiding Officer, the Home Office say that the vast majority of those who have applied during the test phase have been granted status. Yet, there is no information on the number of people who were incorrectly granted pre-settled status instead of settled status. The Home Office must look at this as a matter of urgency. We acknowledge that those granted pre-settled status are faced with many more months of even years of uncertainty. The onus will be on them to remember, perhaps in several years' time, that they then need to reapply for settled status. Presiding Officer, it is incumbent for the UK Government to make sure this doesn't happen. The Home Office must notify individuals when they become eligible to apply for settled status. Presiding Officer, in conclusion, my overarching concern is the same as Trove MacDonald, a grandmother who fears being the victim of another Windrush scandal. The UK scheme is unprecedented in its nature and scale, and entrusting its delivery to the department responsible for Windrush is wrong-headed in the extreme. The UK Government must look again at the fundamentals of the EU settled status scheme and address the urgent concerns I and many others have raised, all of which could critically undermine the ability of our friends, neighbours, colleagues and family to continue their lives here in Scotland. Presiding Officer, let me also conclude by saying this again. This Parliament, and indeed Scotland, welcomes and supports the many EU citizens who have built their lives here and call here home. We are better for having them here. We know they love Scotland and we love them too and want them to stay and continue to feel welcome as part of our communities. Thank you.
Thank you, Minister. That concludes the debate, and I suspend this meeting of Parliament till 2 p.m.
Wherever you stand, get the fresh view of what's happening in Scotland with iScot. Celebrate everything about our country with intelligent, in-depth insight from lifestyle, culture to puzzles, and all the opinions you'll need. Whether it's digital or by post, subscribe now to iScot.
Well, it's lovely to be out on such a sunny evening in Edinburgh, but it's a shame that we have to be out tonight protesting against the two-child cap and the rate clause, well more than a year since Alison Thewlis, my colleague at Westminster, first spotted it in the small print of a Tory budget.
Very glad to see such a huge demonstration today and so many people still coming along 1 year after the rate clause came into force to show their opposition to this vile and despicable policy. The UK government have never been able to justify this policy, and we saw that this week with Esther McVeigh's pathetic attempts to say that the rate clause was somehow double support for women and that gives them some kind of chance to talk about the most appalling and disturbing experience of their life.
As you can see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
It's time to aim high, look resolutely outwards, and never, ever accept second best. Above all, it's time to believe that we can. We can build that better country we know is possible. And friends, we will.
If you enjoy watching our programmes, please help us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster by signing up to become a Broadcasting Scotland supporter.